Today we're at the Sikh Heritage Museum for Sikh Heritage Month. I'm joined here with Pardeep, an expert on Sikh heritage. Pardeep, could you give us an overview on your role here at the Sikh Heritage Museum?
Well, I'm the Executive Director of the Sikh Heritage Museum of Canada. It's a role I played since its inception. We're actually celebrating our 10th anniversary this year in 2014, and we're going to be commemorating it with a special gala called the Toshakhana, which means treasure house. The Sikh treasury housed all the Sikh treasures during the Sikh kingdom times, and it was named the Toshakhana. And here at the museum, I serve as the executive director, and we believe that this is the Toshakhana here in Canada.
So let's get to know you a bit better. Can you share some achievements you've collected over the years?
Okay, well, I don't necessarily speak about my achievements. I think I like to speak about not what I am in terms of my titles professionally. I'm the Human Rights and Equity Advisor for the Halton District School Board, or that I'm a father, or other aspects in terms of my identity or social location. But what I am is somebody that is committed to charitable and humanitarian work. And through that, I have a passion for community service. The Sikh Heritage Museum of Canada is just one of the ways for me to give back. It's a chance for me to empower my community and, in fact, empower all Canadians, because it's not just the Sikh community that gets empowered when they visit the museum. All Canadians get empowered because they get to see Canadian history through a different lens. In addition to that, I serve on the board of directors of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. So charitable work, humanitarian work is never too far away from me. Sometimes I have fun doing these things, the CN Tower stair climb or the annual polar bear dip. At the end of the day, any excuse to make a difference in the community, you can probably count me in.
If you had to describe Sikh Heritage Month in 3 words, what would they be?
Sikh Heritage Month, to me, if I were to say 3 words to describe it, is history, heritage, preservation.
So what's one thing that you wish people knew more about Sikh culture and tradition?
Well, I think knowing our history in Canada as Canadians. We have a long history here as settlers, over 125 years, and we've been part of the social fabric and nation building of Canada. And I think that's important. And then our contributions not only to Canada in the diaspora, our contributions during World War I and II, and many other interesting facts about who and what we are as a people and as a community.
What is your favorite aspect of Sikh Heritage Month festivities?
I think for me, it's about both unlearning and learning. I think it's an opportunity to share out in the community, celebrate, honor, but really to be able to use what we are exposed to during Sikh Heritage Month for the other 11 months of the year. Because I always laugh, if we say it's Sikh Heritage Month, then who's taking care of heritage the other 11 months of the year? And so that's where we always fall in as a museum. We say we're the 12-month Sikh Heritage Month Museum.
If you could travel back in time to witness any event in Sikh history, what would it be and why?
Wow, I'm probably torn between three or four areas that still would fascinate me. And so one would be just the founding days, so Guru Nanak's time. And what was the social milieu, what's happening, how is he inspiring, empowering, thinking, engaging, enlightening. Just fascinating if I could be around that time. The time of the Sikh Empire and the Sikh Kingdom and of Ranjit Singh, and what did that high tide time look like? And then what were the challenges? Because that was a time where the British actually had a couple of Sikh wars, Anglo-Sikh wars, to annex the Sikh Kingdom. I would think Ranjit Singh's granddaughter, Sophia Dalip Singh, the suffragette, and being around her and the suffragette movement and her engagement around that and her whole family engagement of trying to both reclaim identity, heritage, and history, because her sister Bamba was actively involved, in fact passed away in Lahore, trying to retain the family because the family was annexed and displaced. So that would be just fascinating to be kind of living amongst that. And then here as a Canadian, and the early settlers, and I say in air quotes pioneers, because we recognize the Indigenous First Nations peoples of Canada are the pioneers of this land in Turtle Island, but the early settlers and what was happening around that time would just be fascinating times for me.
Are there any Sikh sayings or proverbs that people from different backgrounds can use guiding principles in their everyday lives, decision making, and use as motivation?
Where do I start? I think the whole scripture is just filled with proverbs that can just be uplifting, empowering, and enlightening. I think one of the things that comes to mind, especially today, when we're talking about mental health and well-being, is conquering our mind, we conquer the world. And so what would it take to be mindful instead of mindless? And you know, the challenge we have with social media and taking up so much of our time and energy and almost mindlessness in terms of how you end up going through rabbit holes and spending hours and hours on end, and being more present. And so I think that's powerful. I think the concepts of service and charity. So we have concepts like seva, which is service, and service to others. I think it's important. And we have concepts like dasvand, which means giving a tenth of your earnings. And so I think those concepts are important. I think they're always needed at any time in history. And I think looking through some of those lenses, I think it can be both empowering and uplifting for people to reflect on those concepts.
So we're going to go a little bit deeper into the Komagata Maru incident. So could you give a brief overview about this incident that happened?
Sure. So what's interesting is, you know, when we look back at Canadian history, you know, there's the good, the bad, the ugly. And I would say the Komagata Maru incident falls within the category of ugly. And it's the first time Canada in its history ever turned away a migrant ship. And you know, looking over my shoulders, we're talking about the early settlers and the pioneer community around there. And not too far away from me is the Komagata Maru story that follows right after in 1914. And so, as I mentioned, it was the first time that Canada ever turned away a migrant ship. And what's interesting is, all these passengers that were on the ship were actually British subjects. And so when you think about colonization and colonialism, it was British rule, it was British India. And India didn't get partitioned and independent till 1947. And so you think 1914, the passengers on the ship, technically their identity and their passports are as British subjects. And even today, in 2024, the head of state for Canada is the King. And technically we're all still part of the British subjects, although we have our own sovereignty as a nation. And so you would ask yourself, how could Canada turn away its own people? And so that's the first time that Canada turned away a migrant ship. And it was very unfortunate because we were already having a settler community here, an established community. The first Gurdwara was already established. In fact, many Gurdwaras, by the time Komagata Maru was coming in 1914, there was Gurdwaras in Victoria and Abbotsford, which is the oldest standing Gurdwara right now that's still in existence. And so not only were these passengers British subjects, they were also serving the crown, so to speak, and many of them had military service. And so it was a very unfortunate situation, both for the passengers taking 2 months to arrive here, looking to settle on this soil with fellow Sikhs who already were here. And then they were not allowed to disembark and were left in Bernard Inlet there for another 2 months. And then were asked to leave and took another 2 months. And then there was a tragedy at the end of it as well. And so really harsh conditions when you think about being 6 months on a ship that was never meant to be a passenger ship to begin with itself. And so the story has so many layers to it. There's been documentaries called Continuous Journey by Ali Kazemi, who spent literally a lifetime, when we think about it, you know, about a good 10 to 15 years of his personal life researching. And he also created a coffee table book, and there's many other aspects to that story. We helped get a stamp produced to commemorate the 100th anniversary in 2014 on the Komagata Maru. So it's an important story. In fact, in our museum, we have a book that says 10 ships that rocked the world, and the Komagata Maru is one of them.
Yeah, so reflecting on that importance of this whole incident, do you think that there should be a stronger title for it to be referred as, opposed to just an incident?
Absolutely, and I remember when the stamp came out, because that's part of the language and lexicon that was used to describe it in an incident, right? And again, you know, there's so many different words we can put to it. It could be a tragedy in terms of what's happened to the passengers and the displacement and not allowing either. And so, yeah, I think incident minimizes the totality of what was at stake around identity, nationalism, racism, discrimination, marginalization, any one of those words that you look in terms of what the passengers experienced and what was done to them, what was said to them, how they were treated, you know, the lack of dignity as well. And so there's lots of ways to speak of this so-called incident, right? And not only holding Canada account for its actions, right? And like I said, those are important aspects because incident itself will not cover all the different words I was just sharing with you.
You spoke a little bit upon it, but what ways can the Komagata Maru incident contribute to discussions around racism, discrimination, and immigration policies in Canada?
Well, you know, I touched upon it a little bit, talking about, first of all, we have to be able to name what happened. And so saying the Komagata Maru incident doesn't speak of the racism and discrimination that the passengers were facing. And it was not just the passengers, it was the Sikhs who were already settled here. You know, that's why the book by Ali Kazemi is entitled Undesirables, because that's in part of the social milieu that was going on, and including concepts which you know, we know that similar types of countries as part of the British Empire, like Australia, when they had were looking at a whites only policy. These are real questions that need to be asked when we're looking at this aspect of who, because think, we have books, we share posters that were being disseminated at that time saying free farms for the million. So on the one hand, Canada is sending out posters internationally wanting migration and immigration. And it's interesting, when their own British subjects are coming here to migrate or immigrate, they're not allowed. So what's not allowed? Is it being a British subject's not allowed, or pigmentation and skin color? So then you're also talking about racism, and those things are important. Then you're talking about who is British and who isn't, who's a British subject and who isn't, and who can travel amongst the Commonwealth and who can't, and who has special treatment and who has non-special treatment. And it's not even special treatment, equal treatment, right? Because in addition to that, it's slightly just nuanced different than the Chinese head tax. A white European only had to pay $25. Whereas non-white European had to pay $200, which is separate from the head tax aspect itself. So a Sikh person trying to come into Canada would have had to cover $200 instead of $25. And then in 1907, we're disenfranchised, right? So it took 40 years to get the right to vote. So when you're talking about concepts of policies, immigration policies, laws, you know, who can own land, families were not allowed to come. There was no support for reunification of children and families, so it was predominantly a male settler community until 1920. So you look at so many different dimensions of not just the Komagata Maru, but the community at large, because part of the Komagata Maru was the continuous journey legislation, which was trying to get rid of us. And so there was two aspects to that. One was stopping the flow of us coming into Canada. And so that was what was used against the Komagata Maru in terms of a legal legislation called the Continuous Journey Clause. Equally, there was a plan in place by a future Prime Minister of Canada at that time, William Mackenzie King, and these are the things that are not talked about. He personally came up with a plan to get rid of all of us out of Canada and send us to the closest British territory at that time, which was British Honduras, which today is known as Belize. And so those two things were literally happening simultaneously around 1908 when this continuous journey legislation clause came in, as well as trying to get, so one was to stop the flow, and the other one was to get rid of those that are already here. So there's so much that we should be engaging, learning about, and thinking about and reflecting upon to see the manifestations of what's happening that may be similar in vein today, and compare it with things that have happened in history, and not just place it to say, oh, those days were different. And there's a lot of similarities today that we can point to of what happened during the Komagata Maru incident, as it's known as.
Yeah, so you talk about, I know when I read in your book as well, that more men were immigrating into Canada, not necessarily women and children. Why was that? Yeah,
so when we're talking about immigration policies and who's going to be allowed access, right? And we look across even just the whole plain of what we call North America, including the US and Canada, and the whole Pacific coast, because they traveled that time, commercial air travel wasn't in existence in 1902, 1908, 1914 when the Komagata was coming in. So ship was the primary area. And the shipping route came through, for example, let's just say one of the hubs was the state of Punjab and the province of Punjab. And they would take trains up towards Calcutta and then from there take out shipping routes that would go along Singapore, Hong Kong, Japan. All those were stops along the Pacific coast to get along the coastline of anywhere from California to Vancouver, really, in terms of them coming in. And so, when we're looking at these aspects, you look at even in the US in their civil rights laws. And so it's predominantly men that they're allowing in. And for some of these men that might have not already had family, even them to be able to choose a partner was in the US, for example, around civil rights laws, right? Closest to the pigmentation. And so there was a really interesting early Sikh, Punjabi, Mexican American community that formed in the early 1900s in California. And in Canada here, like I said, those were some of the restrictions. And again, it's those immigration policies that no, because we allow a partner to come, then a family might result in that partnership. You allow communities to come in terms of children and wives, then you're creating a larger sense of community and settlement. And as I mentioned, none of those were what Canada and Canadians were aspiring to or wanted, although it was needed. And so that's the interesting twist of this, right? Because then who's the need, right? Whereas, as I was mentioning earlier, for posters, free farms for the million, who was being offered free farms and who wasn't even allowed migration? And so those are interesting things to look at. And so, and in fact, it took the participation of and our gallant valor in World War I at the Imperial War Conference, where Prime Minister Borden was challenged and questioned of why there's restrictions on this community that just had valor service in the war, and why would you be restricting the children and the wives? And so that's when that got changed around 1919, 1920, that policy to allow women and children to also be present here in Canada. There was a handful of women, by the way, that were here. I think counting literally under 10, including like when on the Komagata Mara, I think there's one or two females that were on the ship, and then just here itself, one of them was allowed to come, who was, and we don't have a direct word for a priest or a granthi per se, but the one that was conducting religious service at the very first Gurdwara on 2nd Avenue, him and his partner were here together.
When did the Komagata Maru incident become recognized as a social justice issue that needed to be learnt from? I have it noted here that I know in 2008, Prime Minister did a formal apology, which they claim it formal. Formal is what happened in the House of Commons in 2016. So you can say, there were a couple of apologies. You can say it that way. Looking at the Komagata Maru incident, when was this incident recognized and given apologies for? So in fact, I think it was recognized right when it was coming in. There was a lawyer that represented some test cases for the passengers, and I think at that time it was already being challenged. It was being challenged on social justice, immigration, human rights, on a whole bunch of different fronts. It was challenged already. And then over the years, in terms of accountability towards it, because I think, like I said, it's now starting to be featured in some history textbooks, and there's a little bit more knowledge and exposure of the Komagata Maru incident. But with respect to the community and looking for some accountability, there's been a couple of apologies. One was done by Prime Minister Harper, and at that time they felt that being at a community event and apologizing was apologizing to the community. The community felt that it was not just a community that we represent as a people and as a nation in terms of as Canadians, and the apology should be given in the House of Commons because this was a national issue. In fact, it was an international issue because Canada consulted with England in terms of what to do when the ship was coming in while the ship was here. And so there was another formal apology in the House of Commons 102 years after the Komagata Maru incident. The next kind of segment that we want to focus on is Sikhism regarding equity and inclusion. How do you believe individuals can apply the principles of equity and inclusion inspired by Sikh values?
You know, I really enjoy the question that you just shared because I've often shared that the Sikh faith was literally, in its most basic form, a social justice movement. And why do I say that? Is because there were inequities that were present in society. And Sikhism was formed within the area of the Indus Valley, which is almost known as one of the oldest civilizations in the world. And so Punjab, the heartland of the Sikh faith, known as the Five Rivers, because the Five Rivers run through Punjab. You look at what was happening around that time in the 1400s of Guru Nanak, and then for a couple of centuries, the successive gurus. And one of the things that was happening socially was the concept of a caste system. The gurus believed that nobody's life should be decided upon as they are born, based on a concept of caste and a social order, and it's going to define and frame your life and what you can do and what you can be and where you can go and who you can associate and who you cannot associate with. And so, concepts like that to challenge those types of inequities and injustices on humans, because humans should be able to define their life when they're born. And other aspects, for example, gender equality, for which 2024, the fight's still going on. But it was not even just gender equality, it was around gender sovereignty. And so the Sikh faith within its own scripture had challenged the notions of gender inferiority for men, and challenged the concept of who are we to call women inferior, for which all humans, literally the King of Kings, are born. All of us are born from a woman, from a female. So who are we to call her anything less? And it was not even about the less, it was not even about equality, because then another concept within the Sikh faith was around surnames, where the males would take on the surname Singh and the females Kaur. And that went beyond just the concept of equality to sovereignty, right? So there was a concept of gender sovereignty. You look at other aspects of the communal meal known as the langar within Sikh Gurdwaras, and anybody can partake in that meal. There's no food restrictions that we serve because it's vegetarian, so it's not a matter of somebody, is it halal and someone else can't eat it? Is it kosher and someone else can't have it? Is it beef? Is it pork? Is it what have you? So it was something that was created around this concept of egalitarian, equal access in terms of who can partake, who can be there. You can be a street sweeper, a politician, a prime minister, a millionaire, a billionaire, a beggar, or a householder, male, female, any aspects of identity, and you are going to have equal access and be treated equally, and all can partake. And so those are important aspects as well. And so then the final piece, because it's one thing to so-called talk about it, there's another thing to walk about it. So we say talk the talk, which is important as a framework, and I talked about some of the things around the scripture and basic foundations, and then there's another aspect of walking the walk. And what did that look like? What did the gurus sacrifice their lives for the rights of other faiths? Two other faiths, two of our gurus had given up their own lives for to fight for the rights. And it was not just faiths, it was the right of people. And so we have that obligation to not only serve and protect, but to stand up for human rights, and those are universal. And so we're standing up for human rights anywhere in the world, for anybody. How
can individuals not of Sikh heritage incorporate the concept of seva, selfless service, into their daily routines?
Well, when we're talking about going into daily routines, we don't need to, our faiths are a foundational piece, and we get inspiration and learning from many other sources, from mentors, from people, from books, and from other faiths. In fact, the Sikh faith has in its scriptures writings from people of other faiths. So it's not exclusive in that sense, and some things are universal and some things are just important enough that I think we can all enjoy and celebrate. And you don't need to be either a spiritual person, or you don't even need to be a person of that faith to be able to benefit from either learnings or teachings. And so the concept of seva, which means service to others, I would just literally count that as our civic responsibility and engagement as Canadians. It's the price for us as humans and humanity for our time on earth. Our time on earth cannot just be about the I. The concept of me and the we and humanity is important, and so service. And so then what would that service look like, right? Service can be done in so many different ways. Service can in part be sharing of your wealth, right? You might not have the time, but you might have some economic means that you may be able to share. You may be sharing your time. You may be sharing of your knowledge or expertise or your wisdom. You may be just sharing by lending a hand. You may be sharing by participating. So there's so many ways to give and to share, to engage, and to celebrate. And Seva is just one important aspect that I think all Canadians can implement in their daily lives.
Could you reflect on the practice of Simran, meditation, and remembrance of the divine?
Well, I probably want to start off by a disclaimer. Simran's actually the name of my niece. But when you're asking about the concept of how we as Canadians can apply some of these values and concepts within our daily lives, when you look at the concept of Simran, in its purest sense, first of all, it's a tool. And it's a tool to be grounded, to reflect, to give thanks. And today many fellow Canadians are paying money to take what we call mindfulness courses. And there's a lot of new mindfulness experts popping up. And really at its core, what those concepts are about and what we're talking about again around mental health and well-being is when do we actually have the time with all the competition around, including social media and all the other aspects of our busy lives, to first of all step back and ground ourselves, find ourselves, to even prepare for the day, to check in during the day, and then maybe even to reflect on the day that went by. And these are important aspects of I think, day-to-day well-being. And so the concept of Simran, we have for us it's theological. It's important for us in terms of grounding ourselves and reminding ourselves of our spiritual obligations, of our civic duties and responsibilities as Sikhs and as Canadians. And so it has an important reverence in there, but the purest concept of that, I think, are concepts that all Canadians can benefit, to take the concepts of Simran to be able to, however they want to, reflect. You look at other communities, Indigenous community and spirituality, they always have openings for events and moments and times. And what is that about? It's about giving thanks, honoring, and remembering the land, the waters, the directions, and a number of other aspects itself, to ground ourselves, to put ourselves in a space to be sometimes receive information, take information, give information, even celebrate. And so, Simran, as I mentioned, is a tool to ground and reflect and meditate and give thanks. And it's something that we can all apply in our lives to make our day-to-day a little bit more balanced, a little bit more manageable, and a little bit more welcoming.
So could you speak a little bit about the practice of langar?
Practice of langar is really at the communal kitchen, the communal meal. If you go into any Sikh institution, the Gurdwara, our place of worship, there is a langar going on as long as the Gurdwara is open, and most Gurdwaras are literally almost open 24 hours. There is langar service. I work for a school board, and we talk about healthy minds and healthy bodies, and that you can't learn on an empty stomach necessarily. And so it's interesting because when you go into a place of worship or a house of worship, you're there to receive wisdom, engage in community. And so I think the concept of langar and sharing meals together, or even just making sure meals are available for anybody in need, are important aspects. And it's not just the concept of langar. It's interesting, I've had a chance to speak in many other places of worship and within other faith congregations. And some of them have talked about the so-called table that they had. I've been with Catholic churches, and they used to talk about almost a concept of community kitchen, the table, and how it used to be inside, and then they moved it out to kind of the front and make it available and out in public, and now it's just gone totally. And so that's for lack of a better word, a service that they don't provide anymore necessarily. Yet within the Sikh faith, it is part of our day-to-day practice within the Gurdwara, that there's a concept of langar. And further than that, the concept of who can partake and participate, and how do you participate, in the sense that the meal is open, accessible to all. There's no restrictions on those aspects in terms of what's being served. And then also how. Everybody sits equally. So whether you're a head of state, you're a millionaire, billionaire, street sweeper, beggar, homeless, or what have you, you're all going to be treated equally, respectfully and fairly, with dignity. And you all sit equally. There's no special seating arrangements or privilege that's given to anybody or afforded to anybody with respect to the meal, how it's prepared, how it's delivered, or how it's shared.
Next, we're going to go into the concept of Chardi Kala.
The concept of Chardi Kala, I will speak to how it's predominantly being shared out in the community, and it's this concept of optimism, right? Eternal optimism, ever optimism. On the surface, it might sound like, that's a great place to try to be at or achieve in terms of state of being or state of mind. Being positive, eternal optimism, in good spirits, in high spirits. These are all different monikers that are used to describe this concept of Chardi Kala. But when you really attach some of its real ethno origins, then you're really looking at it from a theological perspective. And when was it used and how was it used in day-to-day interaction? And so it was actually used as a response to a greeting, any welcome greeting that's being presented to a Sikh. If somebody says, Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh, and they'll ask, how are you? You might respond with Chardi Kala. And what that meant in its purest theological sense was, oh, I'm good, I'm ready, I'm present. I got no duality running in my mind in terms of priorities of what should take priority, humanity and service, or my family and my mortgage. And so when you have duality, you can't make the decisions that need to be authentically made. The right decisions even at times, right? Because you're caught up in this concept of duality. Do I put my life on the line? Look at that concept. When or how? If that has to be a thought process, we might be in trouble, right? And so being in the spirit is saying, oh, I'm good, I'm present, I'm ready for service, I'm ready for need. So what's needed, if anything's needed? And so really, pretty much sharing your state of being. And your state of being was, oh, I'm good, I'm ready. If there's a need, there's a need, and if not, then let's just chill and talk or speak to what we need to be talking about in terms of our worldly duties. And so that's the concept of Chardi Kala, both in terms of some of the language used to describe what this means, but authentically, what would it mean from a theological perspective? Means to be always in the present and the ready. So if there is a call or a need, you're good to go. And so that's being in a state of Chardi Kala. And when you're in that state, then the decision making is different, right? You don't have to step back first and figure out your duality, right? You're there to saying, okay, let's go, and let's go this way, because you're present, right? And it also means within concepts, because the Sikh faith talks about joy and pain, right? Dukh and Sukh, as literally being two different sides of the same coin. And in fact, the only way you can have even a concept of grief or despair or hardship is if you know what joy is. Otherwise, you got no reference point. Equally, you can't have a concept of understanding joy and happiness if you don't know what depression and despair and have a so-called comparator. The other reality is those are aspects that are happening in our lives and can happen simultaneously. You can be experiencing the passing away of a friend, a colleague, a family member. In the same moment, a friend, a colleague, a neighbor can be welcoming a child into the world. And so it's that being present and not getting overly joyed where you lose your sense of your presence, or not going into depression and despair and losing your sense of presence. And so when you look at those concepts, those are all concepts that still lead to the concept, then what state do you need to be in to handle both of those equally state of Chardi Kala, that you can celebrate life, whether it was eight-year life, a 30-year life, a 72-year life, and you can be thankful for that, for the time given on earth, and you can equally be thankful for the new life that might be coming in. So that's what Chardi Kala may look like in a lived practical experience.